Do you remember the 1970s, a time of rising crime, economic turmoil, disco, and technological advances? Among the relics of that era was a certain company that helped popularize and normalize a piece of media that has become very popular today. I'm talking about Atari, the leading company in making video games. They are notorious for how much they fell and rot, but when they rose high. And it was a very influential rise, as it led to the great video games of today. This is the rise of Atari. Before the 1970s, video games weren't very common. However, two men came along and helped start the company we all knew and loved at this time. These two were Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. These two founded Atari in June of 1972. Before this date, Bushnell had actually made a game prior named Computer Space. It was the first arcade game ever made and to be sold commercially. It was a simple game, only having you shoot the most UFOs on screen. It didn't sell well and wasn't a good time for many people though. However, Atari would see some success with its first game ever made, Pong. This was developed by engineer Alan Alcorn, who was also a friend of Bushnell. The game was basically just digital tennis, where you moved two rectangular blocks up and down to keep the ball going for as long as you could. To see if it would do well, the first Pong system was put in an Andy Capp's Tavern in Sunnyvale, California. Almost a month later, it broke, and when seeing what was wrong, it was due to an overabundance of quarters in the cabinet. This, ironically, was clear evidence that Pong was going to explode in popularity. And it did. The first Pong units sold like crazy, garnering about 8,000 units sold. Seeing this success, a bunch more Atari cabinets were produced, like Space Race, Gotcha, and Rebound. These all did fine. Later in 1975, a version of Pong was made for the home, so you could simply play it on the TV. It was sold through the retailer Sears and saw massive success, but things would grow bigger. Only 1 year later, in 1976, Atari was bought out by Warner Communications for approximately $30 million. After the buyout, the iconic Atari 2600 was released in 1977. This system let you play multiple games rather than only one game on it, via the use of the cartridge. Games like Asteroids and Space Invaders were massive hits on the system. However, this is where our story of success ends. The beginning of the downfall started in 1978, when Bushnell was fired from Atari after a big argument with a higher-up. Many games would be made, like Atari, Pac-Man, and E.T., that felt cheap and reiterated the quantity over quality business model Atari devolved into. The video game crash of 1983 soon occurred after the release of the 5200, which was attributed to Atari on top of other things. In 1985, however, Nintendo came along to steal the video game throne, and while Atari did try to stick around, it happened with little success. This big event affected the US due to how it was the kickstarting of a major sector in the entertainment industry, still felt to this day. Games have become more popular and technologically advanced, going to more detailed pixels, then the 3D models, and then even to realistic people in the games. Whole sports have been focused on some games, for crying out loud. Atari practically helped companies like Nintendo and Sega become popular and make big splashes in the video game industry. Luckily, even if some are in Japan, there are still American video game companies like EA, Microsoft, and Activision. This topic is important to know because they help spark one of the most popular forms of entertainment now. Atari showed how much fun you could have on something like a computer, and they laid foundations for what gaming would become a long time later. It's hard to imagine what our world would be like without Atari sparking the popularity of video games. In the end, Atari is a joke now, but no one can deny how revolutionary it was that they turned something as general as a TV into something that you didn't watch, but play.